Since the advent of the COVID-19 here in South Africa, our post-apartheid housing-themed episodes have taken very much a back seat to the conversations locally and around the world via our COVID diaries. This latest episode bridges both directly and indirectly the built environment, housing and COVID-19 within one in-depth discussion and conversation. Almost immediately, COVID became real in South Africa, the recognition that our most vulnerable of communities, those living in our densely populated informal settlements and inner city areas with rudimentary sanitation and poor water supplies, would be most at risk from a virus that thrives on such infrastructure challenges. The National Department of Human Settlements had been swift to issue directives requiring cities and the municipalities to de-densify hotspot settlements that they had identified. And despite those laudable intentions and a recognition of the scale and the severity of the challenge at hand, there are numerous and complex challenges and implications of this accelerated de-densification approach. The challenge of relocating families at a time of lockdown and crisis have increasingly been reported on, and the positions of non-governmental organisations representing different communities have been presented, and many have been against this approach. Today we talk to Suzette van der Walt from the One-to-One Agency of Engagement and Adi Kumar from the Development Action Group. You'll also hear me refer to them as DAG in the conversation. Both are architects by trade, and in this conversation we talk about their insights and perspectives on the issues of density and the de-densification of informal settlements, and we reflect on their specific contributions made to the responses of COVID-19. DAG were co-signatories to a non-governmental organisation response that opposed the National Ministry's plans, and we asked them why they took that angle, what the authorities should be focusing on, and what lessons can be learned looking towards the future. We asked Suzette about One-to-One's recent publications looking at these issues of density and de-densification and the spatial implication of COVID and profiling risk in urban areas. The two documents being the Deciphering De-densification and the Boundary of Home. At the end of the episode, you'll be able to hear how to get hold of those documents, and you'll also hear from Adi if you want to learn more about the work of the Development Action Group. Please feel free to give us feedback via our Twitter platform. You can find us at Talking Transfo and the number 1. As always, we're indebted to our guests for making time to speak with us. We hope you enjoy the episode as much as we did putting it together. So it's April the 30th. It's Thursday before the long weekend here on the lockdown in Cape Town in South Africa. And we're joined today to have a conversation about the question of de-densification and density within our urban areas. We're joined by 3 fellow professionals in and around the country. Up in Johannesburg, we have Suzette van der Walt from the One-to-One Agency of Engagement. Suzette, welcome. How are you doing?
Hey, I'm good, thanks. Cold up in Joburg.
I hear the weather's definitely taken a turn there, correct?
Yeah, I think lockdown brought winter much quicker.
Down in Cape Town, we have 2 colleagues. We have Adi Kumar from the Development Action Group and Kathy Stone. Adi, how are you keeping? What's news from your side?
Very well, Pete. Thank you so much. Everything is good. By the way, a very warm happy birthday to you as well.
Thank you so much. A podcast, birthday podcast. How's that, huh? Kathy, how are you doing?
Great. Thank you, Pete. Really great to be back on Talking Transformation. And I'm really looking forward to the conversation with Suzette and Adi this evening.
Our 2 guests in the last couple of weeks have been out and about making some inputs and observations around this issue of de-densification and density. Specifically, Adi from Development Action Group, you were one of a number of non-governmental organisations or groups who put together a press release, I think it was on April the 11th, if I'm not mistaken, where you had suggested that the approach that the National Department of Human Settlements were advocating, this idea of de-densification of informal settlements, was not something that you're in support of. Maybe you just want to give us a bit of a background to this, the whole issue of de-densification, why you're anti it, and what do you think some of the approaches could be going forward?
So maybe just to acknowledge firstly that, the coordination at the national and the provincial level has been amazing. It's been over a decade that so many civil society organizations have managed to engage directly with the national and provincial departments around critical issues of informal settlement upgrading and the approach that needs to be taken thereof. Linked to this, obviously, there's been also a kind of clear acknowledgement by the departments that, the processes of informal settlement upgrading haven't been as rapid or as effective as all of us would have liked to see. So while this is really impressive and so on, one of the assumptions that we really questioned in this de-densification debate was what is the most appropriate response to COVID-19 and in the context of COVID-19 for informal settlements. And as we started consulting as many civil society organizations in our first coordination meeting with the National Department, reaching out to many communities across the country, asking them what the critical needs were in the context of an upcoming lockdown and so on, the honest answer was that many people did not have access to water and sanitation, basic services, and were really kind of frightened in terms of what the context of lockdown was going to bring to personal well-being, food relief, and other amenities that they would need. So in this context, kind of one of the key questions that we posed at the department was, what is the top priority in terms of response for informal settlements? And part of the reason that we're quite reluctant about the approach towards de-densification has been we feel that reaching out to 29 informal settlements vis-a-vis approximately 3,000 informal settlements nationally is a drop in the ocean. It does not reach the scale and the width and the breadth of informal settlements that are there across the country. Reducing density is not a debate. I think we all acknowledge that, reduction in density in informal settlements is important. It's a question of where we prioritize and how many people we prioritize in this particular debate. The other piece we also know is that the resources and the capacity, both at national, provincial, and local level, are quite limited. It does create the sense that now that we're moving towards de-densification and putting a lot of energies, that it will divert ultimately some resources towards that particular process when there are communities across, both in the Western Cape province, but across the country, informal settlements where hundreds of families are living on very few sanitation and water facilities, which poses a serious risk in the context of COVID-19. And maybe just the last piece around there, and we can talk more about some of the other issues, is really the concern that, in informal settlements, there's a lot of social networks that support the elderly and the vulnerable. And the fact that this process is being coined as an acceleration of existing projects is highly risky, because what it means is that you're creating this pocket of highly vulnerable elderly people that are going to have no social security net and then ultimately have to rely on government to provide relief to them. Whereas in their current condition, they're much better looked after from the social networks and the assets that exist in many of these informal settlements. There has been a lot written up about this internationally as well, from the UN repertoire as well, whose opinion and many of the international views that are coming through are quite fundamentally against moving large numbers of people in and out of informal settlements in this particular context. So I think while this is the debate, we do feel that some of these issues are finding traction, some of them at national level, others at provincial and local level, where municipalities are seeing value in this very critical debate of where we prioritize the issues going forward.
Just to be clear here for our listeners, Adi, what DAG and others are saying is that the principle of de-densification, of recognizing that many of our informal settlements are actually in need of de-densification, of reducing the numbers of people per square kilometre and so forth because of the densities that are exceeding sort of fire regulations, etc. That's not the issue. What you're saying is that that's needed, but it's the way that it's been done under the guise of the COVID-19 and the speed of that and the unintended consequences that may materialize because of that. That is what you're questioning. Am I understanding that correctly, Adi?
That's absolutely accurate, Pete. So, again, we've been insisting that the real focus at the moment has to be around two aspects. The short-term interventions have to focus on basic services, water, sanitation, PPEs, maintenance of existing sanitation and water facilities. And the second piece is being quite mindful and drawing up scenarios of what happens when informal settlements get affected and impacted by COVID-19. If the rate of infections gets into informal settlements, are we prepared with land available for quarantine sites? Are we prepared for the kind of decanting we might need to do or self-isolation that we might need to do in those instances? So we're saying that the capacity and the resources have to be balanced and scenarios need to be drawn up. Nobody is debating that the density in informal settlements needs to be reduced ultimately. That's without fail an important aspect.
Thanks so much for clarifying for the benefit of our listeners and just to make sure we're on the same page. And Suzette, if we turn to you and your organisation One-to-One up there in Johannesburg, I want to paint the picture of I think it was Tuesday or Wednesday last week, having a cup of tea, cup of coffee in the morning, waking up, and there's a mountain of information that's available. I think we've been flooded via social media with various sound bites, clickbait, etc. on COVID. And for something to stand out and actually warrant a second look is often very difficult. But two of your documents, the Deciphering De-densification and then the Boundary of Home, are two such documents that really, really caught my and grabbed my attention. How did you go about preparing these and releasing these documents? What was it you were intending with them, and who did you want to be reading these documents?
Thanks, Pete. Firstly, thanks for receiving them so well. I think there's always an anxiety when you put information out into the world about how it will be received, or perhaps there isn't, and that's why so many people put it out without much thought. I think we question our motives behind these kinds of documents when we're preparing them, and we often there's lots of thinking that goes into it, and there's always this sort of bright, colorful text on the page that says, what is the aim? What are we hoping to do here? And with many of these, and specifically these two documents, the first was, so the Boundary of Home was us trying to communicate some of the frustrations we're dealing with people that we're working alongside, because our work varies from informal settlements to sort of inner city occupied buildings, and that in these different contexts, these things, the idea of self-isolation and of lockdown, it looks different to different people. So that one was largely us trying to communicate something that seems so simple to other people, and the only way we can do that is by using this sort of comparative method of illustrating something in such a simple way. And often when we're drawing these things, we sort of find ourselves asking, is this too simple? Like, are we spending a lot of time illustrating something that's actually relatively straightforward? But the reception was such that it seemed like it was a very necessary thing to do. And then the second document where we were talking about this de-densification process is that there is policy, and in principle, we support the idea of de-densifying informal settlements specifically, or over, buildings in the inner city that are, completely over-occupied. We believe in these things, but what does it actually look like? And if the Department of Human Settlements is saying we need to de-densify, what does that actually look like? And then looking at the processes that have been sort of hitting social media and the mainstream media, where you're seeing people being evicted or what looks like evictions, is that really de-densification, and what is the correct process that needs to be followed? So it comes from an internal need to understand, but our attitude towards media and social media and putting information out into the world is to firstly be useful. So how can we package these things, these internal exercises of understanding these concepts? How do we package these things in a way that they become useful for other people as well?
I thought what was particularly useful in the de-densification document is the way that you started from sort of explaining what the virtues of density were. And you looked at a number of sort of cities and very clear illustrations, very well put together, of what does different density look like. And I think Barcelona was one of the international examples you looked at. And then you brought it closer to home with Santon and Alexandra, which live completely next to each other there in Gauteng and Johannesburg, but are completely worlds apart in terms of urban form, economy, composition of people who live or work in and around those areas. That starting point of saying, density can be a good thing, but it has to be done correctly. And then how does it start to become problematic when we get into those issues of the socio-economic conditions and so forth?
I think to a large extent, the idea which is something so obvious to some of us who are sort of spatial practitioners, this idea that density is a good thing. It was important for us to first explain what we actually mean when we talk about urban density, because very often we deal with people who are in this policy space and they're dealing with space and spatial implications of these things, but unless they see it visually in a way that they can compare it, the impact isn't so clear. And I think this document at the same time was trying to cater to somebody who has nothing to do with these kinds of spaces, but who is reading, some WhatsApp message that got forwarded onto them, and they're hearing about de-densification, and they might think that it's great in principle, and they're not 100% sure. So it's important to say that, and it's really great to always bring in the European cities, because I think the way that at least my training when I was studying architecture, everybody always speaks about these European cities like they're these brilliant spaces, and they are densely populated spaces. So if we can say that great cities are cities that are densely populated, in South Africa, our density is so very low in the spaces that sort of we move through every day, but then you have spaces like informal settlements or the inner city spaces where the density is so much higher, and those spaces are seen as negative spaces. So how do we directly say that we see density as a good thing when it's happening in European cities, but actually these are the risks that happen when the same density is achieved in South African cities? I think what we're trying to say is that density is good in principle, but when density starts becoming dangerous, these are sort of the results and these are the effects that might happen.
I thought a classic example was you were saying in Sandton, there's an estimated sort of 1,500 people per kilometre squared, whereas in Alexandra, across the highway, there are 26,000 people per kilometre. That I thought illustrated very clearly that stark contrast. Kathy, you had wanted to come in.
I was really interested in the piece that Suzette and her team prepared around boundaries of home. And I thought the listeners might be interested in her really elaborating on the conceptual thinking behind it. Because I think, for practitioners like Suzette and like Adi and many others who work in the space of informal settlements, they understand that isolation is not possible because of the way the settlements work. And I thought that the way that was illustrated by Suzette was really well done, and again very simple. But I also started to talk to, and it may be that I read into this, an alternative way of thinking about how we might need to work with communities to mitigate their risks within the context within which they're living.
What was incredibly important was bringing this one home. So what was interesting is that COVID-19 doesn't discriminate in the sense that lockdown applies equally to everyone. Everybody has to stay at home. And that suddenly brought a tremendous amount of anxiety to most South Africans. Everybody suddenly sort of started questioning, how do they go about their daily lives during this time? What does that look like? And despite the fact that the rules were pretty straightforward and it was fairly easy to still continue with getting food, and you were relatively safe within your home, the implication of that for somebody who doesn't live in your situation might be different. So this this was obviously our way of simultaneously trying to illustrate to somebody who might be in such a privileged position that they have no understanding of how it works outside of their own environment, that if you think it's hard for you, just look how hard it is for somebody else. And I think what was really interesting about this is we sort of started by asking the question of like dwelling in the time of COVID-19. And when we think about dwelling, we think about the spaces that we rest in, the spaces that we eat in, the spaces that we cleanse ourselves in. What does it look like if all of those rituals, those daily things that you have to do, if those things no longer happen in the same place? And then also very critically, if you aren't able to work from home, if working requires you to travel from one place to the next, therefore exposing yourself, what does it look like? And then there's obviously the implication that if you are unable to travel for work, you're unable to work. And then what is the impact of that? These kinds of questions are something that we all in the abstract, we can think about and we can be concerned about. But it was so incredibly important for us to illustrate those things, to start off by getting people to interrogate these things differently. And then also hopefully provoking a way of thinking about spaces where people cannot perform all their rituals in the same space in future. And how do we design COVID-proof settlements in future, spaces where we can reduce the size of the boundary that contains the daily activities that people have to participate in?
Adi, I'm really interested in the conversations within DAG about what this means for informal settlements and their kind of structure, their makeup going forward, assuming people will be living in informal settlements for much time to come, and how do we help them to be resilient in situations like this? What reflections have DAG had?
Maybe just to highlight three kind of critical reflections that we've had. So one is clearly around the issue of shelter and how do we enable communities to incrementally get towards a top structure. And that doesn't necessarily mean a top structure that resembles a B&G house, but much more kind of versions of collective housing, and getting co-ops or any of those kind of collective housing models going. And I think that focus on incrementalism towards shelter is a very important aspect or reflection towards where this debate could lead to. The second piece, which has come up frequently in this de-densification debate, so even if you solve the shelter issue, the second issue clearly that's very stark is the issue of location and where you develop land and where do communities situate themselves in that context. So, I mean, just for example, or for humoring ourselves, if you made 300 sites available in Sea Point, people would rapidly move to better economic opportunities, better amenities, and so on. So I think it's really a question about what land is released, and if there is land that is held by the state, by any sphere of government, that land has to come into play quite urgently, both in terms of quarantining, but also in terms of kind of longer term development for communities.
I guess what you're bringing into this equation, Adi, is the whole question of the sort of the medium and long-term costs that are associated with this for the communities as well as the state, when you're talking about the location of these sites that are being looked at.
Absolutely. I think that cannot be put out of the equation. That's a huge component, what it means. And ultimately, I mean, some of it, I mean, we're seeing it around kind of the food relief that's happening across the country at the moment. It's really vibrant citizen networks that are taking control of how food relief reaches the necessary neighborhoods and communities that it needs to reach. We need a very similar approach, which is led definitely by the people on the ground and people in informal settlements, rather than the other way around where they shepherd it to TRUs or TRAs or whatever the case might be. And just to mention the last one, Kathy, the big reflection has been really kind of not just a reflection on the state, but a reflection on civil society organizations as well. I don't think any of us in the housing space or informal settlement space has done enough to accelerate the response that should have been in place prior to COVID-19. And that is really a failure of all of us. I think it's really kind of sharpened, at least in the civil society organizations, kind of new vigor of taking this very seriously and understanding what are the key impediments for informal settlement upgrading, both in the policy space, but also outside of the policy space in terms of procurement and many of the other roadblocks that we encounter. And that's what needs to be resolved and accelerated now, is to make sure that there are no impediments in terms of policy legislation that hold us up when we have to tackle the 3,000 informal settlements across the country.
Just as a reminder, Adi, I think it was 5 informal settlements were identified for that de-densification early days of before April 17th. If I remember correctly, Dunoon here in the Western Cape, there was the Duncan Village, Kennedy Road, quite famous from various documentaries there in the KZN, Situatla in Alexandra, and Mooiplaas in Tshwane. Those were the big 5, if I remember correctly. I think you also reflected that in your document, if I remember, Suzette.
Yeah, those are the 5 that were identified. And they were identified about a week before lockdown even started. So, it is evidence that these were thoughts that were, happening in the Department of Human Settlements before the time.
And then the acceleration of that and your sort of quick to the response there, Adi, what do you think we need to be thinking about alternative approaches during both in the short term, the medium and the long term? What needs to be done in the opinion of the NGOs that were co-signatory to that document?
I think in the short term, kind of our view continues to remain that we need to get and literally take water and sanitation off the table, which means that every informal settlement with access to basic services, I think that is a top priority. Without fail, if you don't have access to water, the risks are highly magnified. So in the short term, we do feel that this coordinated effort needs to focus directly on that. And it goes much more beyond that. I mean, there are some municipalities at the moment that are testing janitorial programs through EPWP and so on, providing PPE. So there is a whole set of kind of value chain that surrounds basic services that needs to be captured right and needs to be coordinated. The second piece, which we're very worried about, and we're seeing some inklings of it, is in the short term, is the food relief side of things. Even though that is not part of our specialization, it has a huge impact as food starts to dry up in the non-metro municipalities. The frustration and the anger towards kind of your condition, just general condition that you're surrounded in, really starts to manifest in a very very ugly way in many ways. So I think that is a huge concern, and it all kind of brings this whole issue of poverty and inequality together. Water, sanitation, basic services, food, economic opportunities, all of these sort of crash into each other and make it quite a difficult issue to deal with. That's why it requires a very comprehensive, coordinated approach in the short term. I think in the medium term, yes, it is important to start doing kind of small scale reblocking, start opening up some streets where you cannot get basic services to communities, start looking and drawing up plans for a much wider cross section of informal settlements that need to be served, and plan in many ways around quarantine sites and isolation in many of these informal settlements. I think the longer term plan really kind of hinges on kind of key policy levers and advocacy work. I mean, that's what needs to be sharpened. We need to be prepared that once this COVID-19 pandemic is past us, that we prepare to really truly accelerate informal settlement upgrading at scale. I mean, currently they say it takes 15 years to upgrade an informal settlement through the UISP program, which is really unacceptable to all of us. I think government admits it, we admit it, that it's really not these are not business as usual circumstances, and we need something quite radical to kind of move and take us forward.
So you mentioned legislative and regulatory, sort of the formal processes as a big source of delay in the upgrading of informal settlements. But to be provocative, community processes, community conflict are also forms of delay. And one can see how it might be tempting in a time of crisis for leaders to try to take the opportunity to push through a process that has stumbled along for various reasons, or possible reasons. Do you think this crisis has perhaps served as galvanizing communities around, sort of working with these upgrading processes where that might have been an issue in the past?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very good point. I hadn't thought of it like that, Kathy. It has definitely served as a way of galvanizing, but it can also serve as a way of fracturing. I think it really goes out in the approach with which the next steps are followed through. So, for instance, on the de-densification debate itself, I think all the legislative rules still apply around public participation. So whether it's consent from people, if they have to be moved off to TRUs, or you need a court order to move people under the Disaster Management Act and general legislation and so on. So I think, yes, you're right. I mean, we shouldn't just hold the crux of the matter is not just the legislative blockages and so on. Community participation and being able to engage with community structures on the ground is equally problematic and equally difficult at the moment, given that there's so much of mistrust between kind of community grassroots networks and government institutions generally. But I think we're seeing in many other spaces and many other sectors, especially in one or two small non-metro municipalities, that this particular COVID-19 pandemic has opened up a completely different dynamic in the way the municipalities are engaging with communities in informal settlements. And that has been very positive. There have been other instances where some of the municipalities are drawing up plans and when asked, virtually said, oh, do we have to draw up a plan for informal settlements as well in the context of COVID-19? So I think it's been a mixed bag. Especially in the way the relationship between government institutions and communities is working. But there is an opportunity, if done right, this could completely change the way people engage with government institutions, especially around informal settlement upgrading.
There's certainly an idea that the chickens may be coming home to roost. That, years and years of slow rate of delivery, slow rate of land release, money wasted, let's be quite frank at times, not spent as wisely as possible. And what we're now seeing is that everything must hurry up and wait. As you say, we're talking almost decades in terms of upgrading of informal settlements that now need, in terms of a political mandate, to happen within months or weeks even. What are the lessons that we've learned from 1994 to this point?
I mean, I wish I was an Indian guru to be able to predict what would happen next, but where I see it, I think a lot of the issues at the moment and going forward that need kind of attention and perhaps require serious reflection is the issue of land release. I think that is a huge component of what's going forward. I don't think systematically planned land has been released and made available for both affordable social housing and any other type of housing. I think that is a key issue if we need to accelerate informal settlement upgrading. I mean, there are kind of things that are in the pipeline. I mean, things like, there is an alignment between various issues that needs to happen around procurement, the water use licenses, the planning regulations, the financial instruments that underpin the housing code. All of these things are currently quite fragmented in many ways. And I think there is a national focus at the moment to align some of these things. But if this alignment actually works, it could see a very different way of going about doing some of these things. And from what we've heard from a few of the provinces so far, that there is some very positive kind of way in which they're interpreting the response to COVID-19 to actually test new ideas, especially around top structure and shelter. And I think that's something that we need to acknowledge, that will be a positive step forward.
On that as well, I think what has definitely come about, and this always does happen with South Africans when there's something that suddenly unites us, is it does feel like the lines of communication between like different interested parties in this, so I'm speaking specifically about NGOs and academia and government, suddenly, from our experience, these lines have not always been so open. But now we have sort of more of a leaning towards task teams and people who really acknowledge that we're in a time of crisis. We have to work together. And what's really helpful is that people are asking for input from other people, where previously it almost felt like there was this kind of guarded way of holding on to these concepts in different spheres. So that's quite helpful. And I definitely think that if something can be learned from this experience, it's that we all have the same interests at heart, and that the sort of processes that bureaucracy also favors development, and that often the housing officials we work with are very easily antagonized. But really, they also just want to do their jobs, and they're also in favor of these processes happening. And it's allowing us to sort of almost humanize the process of all of these different stakeholders, that we're all in this together, we're all panicking together. These issues are important to all of us, and we all would like good things to come from this. And I think if we can maintain those relationships that are busy being fostered at the moment, we might stand a better chance of accelerating in-situ upgrading processes in future.
Never waste a good crisis, I guess. And I mean, Adi, what response have you had from government? And are you able, do you believe that you're going to be able to inform the dialogue going forward in terms of the immediate response as well as the longer term ambition of organizations such as DAG?
Yeah, I think the response has been generally positive. I mean, no dialogue has been closed up. We continue to engage both with National Department along with other civil society organizations as well as with the province. And there is a receptiveness to kind of like engage in this debate and take it forward. Although I do feel that the issue around the 29 informal settlements and de-densification, or whatever word we choose, reblocking or whatever the case, I think that is fait accompli. I mean, I think that's going to move ahead regardless whether we like it or we don't. But that's an area where we don't agree on the approach, and but we continue to engage and coordinate on all the other matters that relate to the coordination of relief works and any other short-term and long-term interventions for informal settlements. So I think both in the Western Cape province as well as at the National Department, we have found quite a receptiveness to engage around these issues and debate these issues openly and publicly and kind of balance it out. I think what we've been kind of a bit averse to has been the kind of media statements that have been coming out that says that, NGOs will support the relocation of households to TRUs, which is not correct. We haven't reached consensus on that position at all, and far from it.
And do you foresee a situation whereby, the COVID crisis might give us some opportunities in terms of the resources, the speed, potentially changes in the legal framework that might assist us in the longer term?
Absolutely. I think that work. So one of the kind of outcomes of this has been the kind of pressure on the National Department to review some of both the legal frameworks, but also put a lot of kind of rethinking how the resources could be utilized. And like I mentioned, some of the provinces are really rethinking how they could utilize the current funding streams, whether it is the HSDG or the USDG, to apply in very different ways to create very different types of shelters, very different types of medium density housing and so on. So I think it has caressed the imagination a little bit in terms of progressive provinces and progressive municipalities. But all we're expecting is an open line of communication so that the concerns that we have are tabled and well thought through. We know from our history of TRAs and TRUs in the city, but in Cape Town and other parts of the country, that these don't remain temporary areas and ultimately become home for an indefinite amount of time. So it requires attention to not just kind of the shelter side, but also the tenure security for people. How long are they moving for? What are the kind of conditions under which they're moving? What is the kind of social security net that they have around them to protect them from shocks in the future and so on. So yes, there is a lot of focus and discussion about what this means in terms of the legal framework, what this means in terms of the funding streams and the resources that might come in the future.
And those medium and long-term questions around what happens once those people are moved really lies in the lap of the municipality, doesn't it? And I was interested in whether Suzette and Adi have reflections on this. Experience has been a very top-down one. As an expert I heard speak said, health crises are necessarily driven from a top-down national perspective, but in a sense that reverberates through different sectors. And so this housing response has been a top-down, and I wondered if it has, in the lessons of it or in the struggles of it, revealed any further resolution for us around where the responsibility should sit. This is a kind of a contested terrain around the three different spheres of government, and where these solutions should be driven from, and whether this has kind of revealed the fault lines even deeper or actually suggested a different approach.
I mean, from my perspective, Kathy, the roles and responsibilities of various spheres of government are quite well demarcated. And yes, in some degree, the direction and the kind of agility and the pace at which the response needs to be comes from the national department. I do feel that local municipalities and local metros and provinces need to take a heavy amount of responsibility in coordinating and making sure that the short and medium term responses are being received. Where kind of some of the things have been quite successful is that the initial focus on water delivery and water tankers from the national department was taken quite seriously by the provinces and so on, and different municipalities across both Western Cape and nationally have received water tankers and so on. Perhaps not in the right locations or not in the right informal settlements, but there has been a responsiveness of taking that kind of national mandate and running with it. It does question when something like de-densification or reblocking or something like this comes up, whether that is the right approach and what views the local municipalities have around these issues. One of the big contentious issues in this place has specifically been ongoing work that's been done for UISP projects over the last 7 to 8 years, and whether those resources are now being redirected to the projects that have been outlined nationally. And that's again a huge risk, because a lot of time and money has been invested in municipalities like Muscle Bay, where UISP projects are about to get implementation ready. But in the context of COVID-19 and new priorities coming from different departments, that focus is shifting. So I think it's also about risk management, that good work and kind of effort that has been put over the last decade or so doesn't get lost, and that these projects that are implementation ready are prioritized as soon as the kind of COVID-19 pandemic is over. So I think that directive has to be balanced with local priorities and local issues, and given equal importance to what kind of information is being gathered from informal settlements through citizen networks, civil society organizations.
Suzette, did you want to come in here around the whole question of how the whole process has been driven? Seems to be a very strong emphasis on from the national department trying to guide the approach.
Yeah, I think if one is sort of well versed with specifically informal settlements and what's happening, you sort of have a general understanding of where your more critical areas are. So when you're talking about these high risk areas that were identified, but I do worry that even though we rely heavily on this crisis response being driven from a national level, and I'm not 100% sure of what the process is, but it does kind of feel like local government is not being consulted enough. Because in my opinion, and Adi, you touched on the fact that sometimes water tanks ended up in the wrong places, that if local government was being consulted during this process, they would be able to identify where the areas are that responses need to happen. because of this ongoing relationship that they have with the informal settlements in the areas that they're responsible for. So as an organization, we have a very good relationship with the informal settlements managers in the city of Johannesburg. And we have sort of ongoing communication about the informal settlements and what their conditions are. And we know that the informal settlement managers have a very good understanding of where the real risks might be in times of COVID. And that's not necessarily where the response is being applied. And I just worry about those lines of communication, whether it's purely top-down or whether local government is being brought into these conversations to decide where prioritized areas should be.
Do you share that view, Adi? Is that something that you've observed in terms of your engagements with the National Department and the municipalities? You've sort of had touch points with both.
Yes, I mean, look, it hasn't been as we haven't been able to feed as much information in some instances. With the province, it's been really great in terms of feeding information about what's happening in non-metro municipalities. I think that's been really, really successful and has worked really well. I think part of the challenge has been that for us in civil society organizations and many other institutions, it's shaken up the way we do our business. I mean, we weren't expecting ourselves to get involved in extraordinary things like food relief and any of the kind of PPE and all of those things. I think in government, what we're realizing is that many people, especially where the information from national is percolating down to small municipalities, they're still stuck in this kind of mentality of saying, but this is not my departmental issue, it's a provincial issue and province must sort this or national must sort this. Kind of the urgent plea there has been, guys, this is extraordinary circumstance and we actually need to break down these boundaries of, departmentalizing, compartmentalizing what is relief, because this is a humanitarian crisis at the moment. So it has to go much beyond kind of like just feeding information to particular people and using them as channels to kind of percolate the information into the governmental system, but rather actually everybody just performing various types of functions simultaneously because the situation is requiring something to that degree.
Suzette, if we change up the question to start thinking about the future of density in South Africa, recognizing that you've made the point that many of our suburbs in the metropolitan areas of South Africa remain fairly low density, and that's been a perpetual challenge for planners, for the designers of cities since 1994. How do you think the conversation is going to change post-COVID? Do you see it as becoming a more challenging space around having a good and sensible conversation about it, or do you foresee it becoming quite a difficult space for architects, planners, engineers, and so forth to have a meaningful conversation, given people's maybe fear factor of density in the future?
I was actually having a conversation with a colleague just before this, because I still believe in density, and I think that density is beneficial from an economic point of view, from a service delivery point of view. When people are concentrated in areas, the opportunities are concentrated. I think, if anything, from this conversation, what will come about is that the density of South African informal settlements, or sort of very densely populated inner city buildings, the density is challenging because it's not smart density. And I think the way that this then starts impacting, this does one thing. It brings to light the fact that people are living very densely in informal settlements without services. Because if people are living densely, but they have access to services like sanitation and those kinds of things, they are able to stay home and be safe during times like this. But not even just that, it contributes to their livelihoods in general. And I also think that this brings in the density conversation when we're talking about sort of South African suburbs or less densely populated areas, where there is sort of this massive push for development of housing opportunities, where you're looking at sort of risks of gentrification and those kinds of things. And I think, if anything, this question of the boundary of home, what this brings about is the danger of high density with singular zoning type of regulations. So where you have developments that are purely housing driven, which speaks to the need for housing. But if people still have to travel distances to get to work opportunities, travel distances to get to access to food, then it's bad density. So if we're looking at a sort of future trajectory, I think this more and more brings to light the need for smart density where people have a variety of things within a concentrated space, and where there is access to services and resources, so that one can, in times of crisis, self-isolate or reduce your boundary of dwelling.
In the paper, Boundary of Home, you actually go into some specifics, Suzette, around the whole question of sort of COVID risk exposure. Do you maybe just want to give a quick overview of what that was about and what you were trying to illustrate?
So that speaks specifically to the sort of when the early thinking around COVID-19 came out, everybody said you must isolate and you must sort of close in your circle, because the more people you meet, the more you increase your risk of exposure. So as soon as you have to travel to do something, you're more likely to encounter other people, you're more likely to encounter unsanitized spaces that you have no control over. So if you can reduce that, you're naturally reducing your risk of exposure. And to me, that just speaks to good urban environments in general. If everything is within walking distance, I'm encountering less things. And on a good day, when people aren't self-isolating, you'll also be encountering more people, where our current way of living in South African cities is these long commutes to get to the things that should be part of our daily lives.
So I was really just interested in a very short-term question around how organizations like the one Suzette works with and DAG are managing to continue to play the very, very important role they play, but able to do that in a safe way for their own staff and maintain those links and channels with communities that allow them to play that kind of navigation role with the state, and how you're managing to adapt to that without stepping away, which obviously would be disastrous.
This is actually proving quite difficult. I think we're fortunate in that the spaces that we engage in, we have really good relationships with the sort of community leadership structures. And we also have a very good relationship with other human rights organizations in the area, who we never engage in a specific area or with a specific community without there being other parties present as well. So it's these really strong networks. And as I mentioned earlier, we have a fairly good relationship with the city of Joburg as well. So the lines of communication have remained open. And I think what's been incredibly important for us, and I think that's something I've been stressing within our organization as well, is that we always acknowledge the humanity of everybody in these processes. And you acknowledge the fact that the city official who you're busy having a disagreement with also has children that are suddenly at home, and this person also has to homeschool his children suddenly during this time. So, and as soon as we can start doing that and like really humanizing each other during this time, and this includes humanizing the person who might potentially be homeless as a result of COVID-19, then the conversation starts taking on a different light.
Building on Suzette's answer, I think, so it has been quite difficult. I would say we've kind of had to play two roles at the moment. One is being a very genuine conduit to issues that come up in particular informal settlements and communities, whether it's occupied buildings or any of those, being a genuine conduit that can relay information from the grassroots up to the government without really mediating what the message is. I think that's been quite helpful in capturing information about what is actually happening in this particular space, and it's information about various things from water, sanitation, food, etc., etc. I think the second piece, which is equally kind of has been quite useful, that all in the kind of mediation process, we've had to kind of adopt quite different ways of organizing communities. I mean, using digital technology, Zoom, WhatsApp, all of those things has been quite complicated and challenging to get community leaders to reach out to people that are vulnerable, making sure that the soup kitchens have enough supplies, all of these things, capturing information on whether the waste is being removed, whether there's enough water, whether there's enough sanitation facilities being cleaned and maintained. So I think that has been a really interesting process. And I think once kind of 2 weeks into the lockdown, once the leaders have gotten accustomed to figuring out how to do this, it's actually been really interesting to see how much responsibility people have taken, especially community leaders have taken in terms of their living environment. It really has been phenomenal. I mean, in most areas, we're just experiencing an extraordinary amount of citizen action, particularly in informal settlements, coming forward and stepping up their game in terms of organizing, in terms of relief efforts and so on. And just lastly to say, I think it has also kind of shed light on this is beyond DAG and beyond civil society organizations. And to be honest, it's really shed light on how much coordination is required amongst civil society sector itself, beyond the kind of NGOs that work on this particular issue, much beyond that, to see a much bigger picture and be less pedantic about our own agendas and our own kind of areas of specialization and expertise.
Fantastic, Adi and Suzette. Thank you for sharing those perspectives. I think they were very, very helpful. It brings back as a very strong sort of human element to the discussion. Suzette, let's deal with the two documents. You've invited comments on them. How can people, first of all, get hold of a copy? We'll share that in the links that go out with our episode digital flyer and in the bulletins and so forth. But how do people go about finding those documents online?
It's quite difficult to really also manage having a presence and manage doing work at this stage. But we're sort of relying very heavily on social media channels. So most of the work that we put out is going out from our Twitter account, from our Instagram account, and it's also on our Facebook page. And then we also have a website. Largely, these documents were designed to be distributed via WhatsApp. We sort of saw that as our minimum viable delivery of information. So we're hoping that through this sort of rogue, forwarding of information via WhatsApp, that in between all the fake news, we might be able to get people's attention. And that's sort of what we've been relying on so far. And it's so strange because every time I send the documents to somebody, they sort of ask for permission to share them. And the point is to share them. The point is to distribute all this information. And there should be a couple of follow-up documents as well that will hopefully make their way across the country via these same channels.
The website address?
Yes, so it's one-to-one.org.za. Super simple.
Perfect. And Twitter?
Twitter handle is one-to-one_AOE.
Thanks for that, Suzette. Adi, from your side, how do people get in contact with or engage with the Development Action Group?
So our website is dag.org.za. And our Twitter handle is dag_activism. They can reach out to us. There's a Facebook page as well under the name of Development Action Group. So they can reach us there. And all the documents, including the statement to the National Department, the public opinion piece that came out in Daily Maverick, all of those things are publicly available on our Facebook page and website.
Fantastic. Colleagues, well, thank you so much to the three of you for sharing the time this afternoon with us. Thank you for being out there on the front line and engaging with not only the communities that you're representing, but also those agencies and departments who are trying to address what is such an overwhelming challenge. And I really do hope that the lessons that we learn and are learning on an hourly, on a daily and a monthly basis will take the conversation forward and improve the way that we go about our work in the future. To yourself, Adi, and the DAG team, to Suzette there with One-on-One up in Johannesburg, we really wish you the best going forward. Please keep us in the loop. Let us know how you're doing. And hopefully we can have a chance to catch up with you again in the coming weeks, coming month or so, find out how you're doing and where you're at in those discussions. Really appreciate your time, colleagues, and all the very, very best.
Thank you, Pete, Kathy, Suzette.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Adi.
Thank you. Thanks.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Talking Transformation podcast. Please engage with us and let us know your thoughts on this episode. You can do so via the Anchor podcast platform. There's a voice message function available via the app. You can also follow us on Twitter via Talking Transfo and the number 1. So Talking Transfo 1. Our theme music is kindly made available by Tribal Need. Find out about the music, the street art shows here in Cape Town and Europe via tribalneed.com.